And I mean, it's an honor to be able to represent Journal of Financial Reporting on a panel with the most prestigious journals in our field. I figure it's step one toward where we belong. So you know, I'm going to have to. You know, we're not maybe as prepared as we were since as of about half an hour ago, we were going to be last in the day. My notes start with good afternoon. So good afternoon. And, you know, I think you know the panelists, so I'm just going to jump right in with the big blanket disclaimer. Nothing any of us says is representing the official position or policy of our journals unless we say otherwise. Okay, so we have Mary Barth representing the Accounting Review, Christian Leutz representing Journal of Accounting Research, and Joanna Wu representing Journal of Accounting and Economics. I'm going to be jumping around. You know, not everyone has something distinct to say about each question, so we're going to jump around a fair bit and hopefully leave time for you to grill us. So one more thing I want to say before we get started is that you know, preparing for this panel, I took a look at the CARE mission. And if we edit out the bullet points in the middle, we end up with encouraging and supporting young faculty, my emphasis, to strengthen the bridges between accounting research, accounting education, and accounting practice. So I've asked the panelists to be directing their remarks, you know, not so much to sort of the systemic issues and the ecosystem of accounting research that came up a lot yesterday, but really to young faculty. But that said, boy, we were on the receiving end of a lot of commentary yesterday. And so my first question is just to ask the panelists to talk about you know, what they took away from that, if they have any responses, and if there's anything they would consider asking their journal to do differently in response. So Joanna, I'll start with you.
Thank you so much. I'm from the University of Rochester. And first, I want to thank Rob for inviting me to be a part of this panel and for all his work organizing the discussion topics. And we've been receiving multiple revisions of the topics, and the latest revision, which I believe is the 5th round, came at 10:30 last night. I was so happy that I caught it this morning, especially given that we are the first panel to go. So we just caught that in time. You know, like Rob said, you know, over the last day and a half, you know, I have heard a lot of interesting ideas, thought-provoking or provocative, and I can definitely see the need for tighter links between academic research and practice and regulation. And I think the profession has been aware of that need and been working towards that in many ways for a very long time. But I do understand, you know, the reason for the introspection and the soul searching, I may say, you know, over the course of the conference, and especially with you know, the business school business model probably under pressure, the sustainability of our sort of you know, way of organizing what we do maybe in question. Now, being on the panel of editors, I want to make a few observations from the perspective of evaluating and assessing papers for publications. So I have only a couple of them, so it's not going to be very long. And so the first one, I think I'm just stating the obvious. So many studies that do not have a policy or practice as its subject matter, nevertheless went on to have huge impact on policies and regulations and practices. And you know, I can give many examples. but we have another question down the road that Rob has structured for us, so I'm going to save it for that. So the point that I try to make is that we need to be careful when we are assessing the real-world implications of a piece of academic research based on its immediate and stated objective and subject matter, because we may not be able to see the full picture. My second point is related to that. So the real-world implications may not be evident on first sight. Sometimes the full scale of a paper's real-world implications may not be apparent for years or decades after the initial publication. So take probably an extreme example, the efficient market hypothesis. Of course, it has wide-ranging implications, and it has impacts on economics, the various business fields in more ways than we probably can count. So its influence cannot be overstated. Now, one of the implications of the efficient market hypothesis that we see nowadays as being very clear is that it is sort of the rationale underpinning passive investing and indexing. Now, if you look at when the efficient market hypothesis was first formally formulated, it was back in the 1960s. And some may say that the initial seeds of the idea went back even further. Now, the first index fund was set up by Vanguard in 1975, I believe, which was 10 years after the initial formulation of the hypothesis. And the sort of the flourishing of the indexing investing industry really hasn't happened until the last couple of decades. So if we are looking at a piece of academic research, and we are trying to use the real-world implications as a metric that we want to use to decide whether this is something that should weigh towards or against the publication, we need to be very much aware of the limitations that we are facing, which is we cannot really make a very good judgment on that just based on the subject matter of the paper and what its immediate objectives are. And lastly, a lot of discussions yesterday touched on how valuable our independence is, the objectivity of academic research. And when you talk to regulators, policymakers, this is actually what makes our work compelling to them. Our independence and objectivity is actually what makes our work valuable to them. So in that spirit, I want to mention a paper that was published 40 years ago by my colleagues, Ross Watts and Jerry Zimmerman. It was published in 1979 in the Accounting Review, and the title is The Demand for and the Supply of Accounting Theories, the Market for Excuses. So what the paper does is, some of you might have read the paper, the paper was around 40 years ago, some of you might not have read the paper, but I highly recommend if you have not looked at the paper. So the paper warns against academic research being used as fodder for political purposes. And this is with the academic research, the underlying academic research being done with the best of intentions and the highest academic rigor. Still, that is a risk. So with that, I want to hand over to the next person.
Okay, that'd be Christian. Yeah, so I also want to thank Rob for putting an enormous amount of work into this panel and for the conference organizers for putting it on. It's an honor to be here. I'll keep mine brief so that we have the opportunity for a Q&A, and I agree with many of the things that Joanna has said. I have a few things, your question was, are there things that you want to respond to that we heard yesterday? That I disagree with, and there's a few things I disagree with, which I will reserve for the closing panel with Scott, because they're not necessarily related to the journals. But where I do disagree, and it will kind of dovetail with what Joanna just said, is I'm worried about this notion that we need to produce research that's more policy-oriented or more policy-relevant. I mean, oftentimes, I think this will be perfectly fine for research to have that focus, but I think directing research in that direction is dangerous and potentially problematic. And if I sort of look at it from JAR's perspective, my sense is that JAR would generally say that research should enhance knowledge, and most journals would probably agree with that, whether or not it's policy relevant. And I would particularly wanted to emphasize one aspect, which is that many of the sort of journals that are at the top of their fields, they view themselves as general interest journals. And as general interest journals, I think the notion is that you don't single out a particular audience. And in this case, if you direct the research towards being policy relevant, then I think the audience would be, say, the regulators. We've also heard that research maybe needs to be more relevant to practitioners, and so you single out the practitioners. Again, to me, the standard should be, do we learn something from a paper? And then there's different degrees to which we learn, which may decide whether a particular journal will publish the paper or not. In my mind, sort of having heard the discussion yesterday, should think a little bit more about a division of labor, where we maybe need, in the end, if we want journals that aggregate research in particular areas or with a particular focus, then maybe what we need is journals that have sort of that particular focus. So to give you an example of this, the AER, or the AEA as the organization publishing the AER, American Economic Review, has a couple of years ago basically created subjournals that are just underneath the AER, and one of them is the AEJ Economic Policy. You know, there's one on macro, and there's one on micro, and there's one that's particularly focused on economic policy questions. And so that is, in my mind, an example of where you have potentially sort of a specialization of a journal. And that's something we should, you know, consider, whether that's maybe something that under TAR, or, you know, we have a few journals that have that regulatory focus. And so maybe we need to make sure that these journals get the attention that, you know, the topic deserves. But I think this notion of telling young people to do policy relevant research is problematic. Stop here.
Thank you. Mary?
Well, I don't have a lot to add, because I think the three journals represented up here have largely the same mission. As a matter of fact, Rob was kind enough to send us each other's mission, and
Reminded us.
yeah, reminded us. There you go. And you know, those of you who know me know that I'm very much in favor of doing research that relates to practice. That's what I've personally been trying to do for my entire career. But that doesn't make it part of the mission of the Accounting Review. And unless policy changes, the policy of the journal changes, it's not going to be a criterion for publication in Accounting Review. Doesn't mean it's not desirable. It doesn't mean, I personally think you get two bangs for the buck, right? You can contribute to the academic literature and policy at the same time. That's twice as good as just one. But that doesn't mean that TAR is going to be open to just policy-related research that doesn't contribute to knowledge. Now, having said that, as senior editor, I don't have a lot of influence. It's not my journal, the AAA's journal. I'm a steward of this journal, not a designer of it. But one of the things I have encouraged the editors to do is, if they see policy relevance in a paper that they're editing, to make sure that that comes across like in the last paragraph of the paper. Not bold statements about how, you know, if you do this, it'll change the world, but what does this paper say about a policy question? If it does. If it doesn't, that's fine too. But if it does, to help people connect the dots. There was comment yesterday, I can't remember who made it, but sometimes our papers just say, this paper is relevant to standard setters, regulators, and policymakers. And leave, you know, it's then they pick it up and read it, and it's a mystery. Really? Is that right? How do I figure that out? So to the extent we can connect those dots for people so they can see what's going on and how we're thinking about the paper, that would be helpful. And but I'm leaving that up to the editors to encourage authors to do that when it's appropriate, when they really feel that the study does in fact speak to something that they can say meaningfully to policymakers. And I have some big comments later too, but I'll leave it at that.
Well, it turns out you're up next on the next question, which is, I've asked each of the editors to identify a paper published in their journal that does speak to practitioners or policymakers and still meets the standards as spelled out by the mission and policy of the journal, and maybe draw some broader lessons from that.
Okay. I unabashedly chose one of my own papers because I know it best. And in my defense, it also won the Wildman Medal that Maureen mentioned yesterday that the AAA and Deloitte gives for paper that is likely to influence practice. Whether it does or not is a different question, but this is Barth, Hodder, and Steuben, 2008, Fair Value for Liabilities and Own Credit Risk. And to me, there's sort of 5 key elements to a paper that both meets the criteria for contributing to the academic literature and speaks to practice. The first one is what I have called motivating question. The question answers an important practice question, or at least addresses, it doesn't answer, addresses an important practice question. This was Paul Beswick's first provocative point yesterday, and as Hal Schroeder said, the hot issues in practice are research opportunities, and this is a place where you can grab a research opportunity from something in practice. So the paper addresses the issue of whether changes in fair value of debt attributable to changes in an entity's own credit risk should be recognized in net income. Not a question that research can answer, but that's the question that was being grappled with. Highly controversial question in practice. This is one of the carve-outs from the European Commission when they adopted IFRS. Can academics shed any light on this question to help the standard setters figure out whether they're on the right track or the wrong track? Well, the second thing is taking that motivating question and turning it into a research question. Those are 2 different things. One is why you're doing it and how you're thinking about a question that might, a research design that might speak to that question. The second is what you can actually do in the paper. So the research question that we addressed is based on Merton's 1974 model to try to provide insight into this question. Is the effect of credit risk changes on equity returns mitigated by leverage? So when the credit risk changes, is the effect less on equity when the firm has more debt in its capital structure, which is a clue that the debt holders are sharing in some of this credit risk change. And then the second part of the paper says how is descriptive statistics on how would net income differ if fair values of debt were recognized. And I'll come back to that in a second. So the design is based on finance theory, Merton 74, but it speaks to the question. His theory on levered equity is exactly what we're talking about here. And that gives us the basis for thinking about the issue and structuring the tests in the paper. And the good news for us was that this aspect of Merton's theory had not been tested before. There's a lot of work testing Merton's model, but various aspects of it, not this one. So this allowed us to make a contribution to the literature by saying, hey, wait a second, we have a model, and we'd like to test this too. So that was our door to the contribution to the academic literature. The second bit I mentioned, the descriptive statistics, this is something that the editor allowed us to keep in the paper, even though it was descriptive, and I think we're going to talk about descriptive work later. It's in the back because of this, I think, but this is part of what the practice community would like to see. How big are these effects? Merton's model says it's concave, asymptotes. Is the effects very, very small for most firms, and it's just in firms in financial distress where there's a big problem? Or is the effect big enough even for firms that are highly successful? And our paper is able to provide descriptive statistics on that by inverting the Merton model and providing some estimates. And I was pleased that the editor allowed us to keep that in the paper, because we heard this yesterday, that they want some idea of magnitudes and how big is the problem, how pervasive is the problem, is this something they should even be worried about? So the next element is relevant and sound inferences. So hopefully they're sound because they're based on your research design. But the inference is that all asset value changes do not accrue to equity holders, even for firms that have lots of assets that are not in financial distress. So these concerns about the anomalous income effects are not unwarranted, but they are pervasive. So then the last element is, what should standard setters do differently after reading the paper? And this is a question that Charles Lee taught me to ask, and I recommend that to everybody in the room. When you write your paper, get to the end and say, who's the audience and what are they supposed to do differently now that they've read your paper? Well, whose priors have you changed? And here, what should they do differently? The good news is, I think the answer is stand your ground. You've got it right, or at least as far as we were able to show. We provide support for the standard setter's position that fair value liabilities are candidates for inclusion in net income. They meet the criteria that they set forth in conceptual framework. So to me, this is an example of how I think about a paper that can contribute both to academic research and to practice.
It's too early in the morning for me. Still struggling. So I actually not only struggle with the morning, but also with coming up with an example so Rob asked us to think, as Mary said, of an example in our journals. Given the topic of the conference being regulation, and this is an area in which I've worked, I find that there's tons of examples. I actually think yesterday the notion was almost a little bit, it's hard to find research that has any relevance or would speak to regulators. And I mean, maybe I have my regulation rose-colored glasses on, but I find we have lots of stuff. And so when I was thinking about the examples, I found it hard to single out or which one to pick, because if you think about the big regulatory changes we've had, Sarbanes-Oxley, IFRS adoption, regulation FD, I can't think of one where we haven't done studies and where people haven't looked at the economic consequences of these regulations. People often take the regulator's motivation and then look at the intended effects. What did regulators say they wanted to achieve? And then they look, did we achieve this? People also study very often the unintended consequences, where the regulation may have had impacts that we didn't necessarily anticipate or didn't intend. So good examples of those would be where studies point out some regulatory avoidance actions, right? So think about studies on, say, deregistration, where all of a sudden people were either leaving the public markets or leaving the registered, the SEC registration. People going in different trading venues or firms, or the situation where we've studies where firms have an incentive to maybe stay below the float that the SEC set for some of the regulations. So I think there's a lot of studies that we can very quickly think of that would contribute interesting insights and study regulatory outcomes. And so, again, that's sort of something I was struggling with yesterday. But the thing that I wanted to emphasize is that papers that don't focus on regulatory events or don't explicitly say that they speak to regulators could still often be highly relevant, right? So take work, that was very important at the time I entered the profession, was sort of work around sort of what are the effects of disclosure, say, on liquidity or the cost of capital. They're not specifically on regulation, but that is one of the key links that regulators will think about when they think about, say, new disclosure rules or new accounting standards. And so if there's papers that help us understand that link and to what extent that link is solid, those papers will have, in my mind, have relevance and will contribute something to the regulatory debate. And so sort of my advice is to some of the younger people, since that is part of the focus, would be, I'd say, do what you find interesting and exciting, and don't worry so much about the audience. I mean, you want to worry about that your paper has something to contribute and that it's novel and new. But the novel and new can take different shapes and forms. It sometimes is that you're studying a regulatory event. That sometimes it is that you're showing that there is a limitation to a relationship that we thought existed. And in the end, I think if if we're doing the kind of work that excites us, that's usually when we're best at it. I'll stop here.
Joanna?
Yeah, so I want to echo, many of the points that Christian just raised. I feel like it's almost difficult to find a specific paper that would be the representative of this, large volume of research that speak to specific regulations, and I also want to, so go back to my previous point, which is you do not need specific regulations as the subject matter or immediate objective of the paper for the paper to have a large impact in that regard. So I do want to bring up a paper by Ribal, I Speak Authority, and Ashok Robin. It was published in the JAE 2000. So the paper had no specific accounting regulation as its sort of focus. The title of the paper is, let me see. The effect of international institutional factors on properties of accounting earnings. So basically, the paper seeks to understand what are the fundamental forces that would shape the properties of the accounting information. Now, the paper eventually had very large impact and influence over the subsequent research on international accounting, and especially against the backdrop of the adoption of the international financial reporting standards. So that is a paper where we can probably describe it as a positive accounting research. It seeks to understand how the world works, and that is really the foundation for us to understand what kind of regulations are going to affect the environment, the economy, the organizations in what specific way. So I guess that what I'm trying to say is, focus on things that are interesting, that you find that are exciting, and it doesn't really matter whether this is something that specifically targets a particular regulation or a particular practice, as long as this, the paper generates unique insights, and that is basically the goal of our profession.
Thank you. So I have a question specifically for Christian now, which is you made some comments about causal identification yesterday, and I'm hoping you'll elaborate on those wearing your editor's hat.
Thanks. Yeah, so yesterday I already gave you an example that was my, and probably was bad news right before the cocktails to tell you that, the evidence on the positive health outcomes of alcohol are limited. But, it didn't stop us, I know. But to me, this example is a really good one because it clearly illustrates when we want to provide evidence that is used by others, in the form of, in this case, it would be a recommendation that would go maybe to doctors, what they should tell their patients, why it would be important to be really solid about what the causal link are. But here I wanted to give you an example it's sort of closer to our home and is in accounting. So, and here I am going to use an example of some work that I've done with Lucy and Hans. Think about the work on IFRS adoption. There's well over 100 papers on IFRS adoption. And if you look at these studies, many of these studies find various positive capital market effects and effects on investors, and generally are labeled or described as IFRS effects. And so the way I would interpret that in a causal way, it would be saying IFRS, caused these outcomes. I'm not saying that all the studies necessarily make a causal claim, but I've seen how, for instance, the EU has reviewed some of that work when they reviewed IFRS adoption in the EU. and they lean fairly heavily on these papers and will make statements about IFRS has had capital market benefits. So what Hans and Lucien and I did in a paper that's published in the JAE, we basically went back, and so this was several years after, we've had already lots of studies on IFRS adoption, and talked about what some of the challenges are to identification in that setting, how there's contemporaneous events you have to worry about, how the regulation, why even from a conceptual point of view, it's not exactly clear that we should be seeing some of the effects that we have been seeing, or to what extent they might be a combination of effects. And so, and we used those, nasty fixed effects that we were, sorry, Bob, that we were yesterday saying that make people sometimes sort of turn away from a paper, but they were really necessary in that study to kind of tease out some of the effects, right? So one of the things that we were trying to do there is exploit, and this is something that I think is actually nice in accounting, because firms have different fiscal year ends. We were using sort of the differences in fiscal year ends together with the fact that liquidity is moving very fast, so that we could use basically the fact that some companies had to adopt it in December, others had to adopt it in June, and so we were seeing the financial statements at different points in time, so that we could really get to the effect of the financial statements rather than some of the other, concurrent events. And when we did that, the results looked markedly different from what we previously had seen. And so, to me, this illustrates sort of the importance, because, again, people are using our results. And to maybe sort of dovetail with my earlier remark, why I'm somewhat concerned about directing research, is I think, if anything, sometimes we're a little bit too quick in saying that our work has certain policy implications, and have to be really careful about the sort of the should part or the normative part of our work. I mean, we had before this paper, we'd written another paper on IFRS adoption, where in the abstract, we had already said that we think that it's unlikely that the effects were driven by IFRS. That paper still gets heavily cited as showing, IFRS effects. And I think it's in part because of this, I think, desire that we have to speak to the regulators and produce evidence. And so I think this is sort of more of a cautionary note to say we need to think very carefully, like we were saying yesterday, words matter, on how we label our variables. And so the fact that in a lot of tables it will say there's an IFRS dummy very naturally makes people interpret this must be an IFRS effect.
Yeah, I was thinking about this after the interchange yesterday, and I think Bob was right. Bob Kaplan, well, he's almost always right. He's one of my mentors, so I think. But we need coexistence, because I think the study that Christian talked about, they're very valuable, but that's not necessarily the only way to do things. And we do social science, not pure science, if there is such a thing as pure science. And to me, this means that every situation is different. So even if we determine something would cause something in a particular, usually narrow circumstance, and sometimes you have to actually look for a circumstance in which you can conduct these tests. Not every circumstance lends itself to this. The practice takeaway might be clear in that circumstance, but the takeaway for other circumstances is that the change or whatever was studied could make a difference, but not necessarily that it will, because you move forward in time, you change locations, there's all sorts of other things going on. And the beauty of the fixed effects that Christian was talking about is that it controls for all of that stuff. But the problem with it is it controls for all of that stuff. So we don't really know what it is that is important it's been controlled for, so it's gone. But is it important in the next circumstance? And without replicating all the factors in a particular setting, you don't know whether that causal inference is going to travel. And so I think we need to understand the factors that drive the effects as well as controlling for them. And I think that's why we need to take alternative approaches to various problems to figure out what's going on. And some of it's theory. Theory can show us what some of the factors are. Some empirical tests can take some of those factors and test them. Other studies can look at, nice, clean causal inferences and nice, clean settings to see whether they're there or not. But at the end of the day, research is a mosaic, and each paper puts in a part of the puzzle and can't answer every single question. So I think debating which way is best or not best is not very fruitful. The best approach to me is a variety of approaches, triangulate, and then see what picture emerges from the body of the evidence.
So I was taking a bunch of notes yesterday, and late last night sent a question on each one of them, and we never got a chance to circle back so that I would know who actually wanted to say something about any of them. So I'm just going to list 4 issues that we heard about yesterday, and you can each respond to whichever ones strike your fancy. One thing we heard is that if you're going to do research that's relevant to policy and practice, you may need to use methods like detailed interviews or small sample surveys, things that don't lend themselves to statistics and p-values, and we don't see much of that in your journals. So that's one thing you could speak to is, I guess I'd just call it non-statistical methods. We heard some very interesting stuff from Doug Shackelford about UNC's faculty looking at managerial relevance. And so, I'd love to hear what you have to say on what role that plays at your, in your editorial processes, if any. Related to that is that some research comes, so Shiva talked about the value of having research not funded by tuition, but funded by interested outside parties, and we have the Foundation for Auditing Research, did I get that right, in the Netherlands, and the Center for Audit Quality here in the US. How would it affect your editorial process at your journal if a paper came with that imprimatur? And then finally, Margot started by complaining about editors, and then she complained about all of the rest of you reviewers for slowing everything down. And I got some. Is Margot still here? Slowing everything down, and I talked with her a little bit later, and she, talked about demanding, why does one study have to do everything? And that, at some point, don't you just stop, publish it, and let the next paper go, tackle that topic. So again, just to summarize, because this was long, non-statistical methods, the role of managerial relevance, support from organizations like FAR and CAQ, and issues of timeliness. And you can respond to any or all of them, and I will actually let you guys decide who wants, whoever's ready. You might need to you're ready.
I'll just take the top one, because you and I did have 2 minutes to talk before the session. These are new from the email this morning, so we haven't given a lot of thought. But I just want to observe your question about non-statistical methods. Let me just say, I don't have any view on whether statistical methods are not statistical methods. It's whatever is appropriate for the circumstance. TAR is open to all kinds of different things. But I did want to comment that you framed the same question 3 or 4 different ways.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me that they seem to go together, at least in your mind, that I don't know if they go together in everybody else's mind. So the email that we got this morning talked about descriptive studies, and that they often use interviews and small sample studies and those sorts of things. Non-statistical was kind of a sidelight, because it is possible to use statistics with interviews, and right. So, And it's possible to do descriptive studies that aren't field studies or interviews or case studies. So these are all things that I think get jumbled up in people's minds, and they're different topics. So let's not mix them up. I mean, research methods. TAR doesn't care what kind of research methods you use. We have either I have editors can handle it, or I can get ad hoc editors to handle it. So don't worry about the kind of methods. Descriptive studies. Sometimes descriptive studies are very insightful. And actually, I think descriptive studies that are done by people in this room, people with background in the literature and training in economics and finance and accounting and have read the literature, the descriptive studies that those folks do, can provide really interesting insights, a lot more than somebody who doesn't know anything about the field can run some descriptive statistics and give you means and standard deviations of about a bunch of variables, but why? Why those variables? Why not? And by using what we know, you can select what descriptive statistics you want to provide because you know what the question is, and therefore what insights you might be looking for, or at least start a literature on. So I think there are different types of descriptive studies. Some are suitable for top journals, and others not so much. But it depends. It's hard to put all studies that do descriptive work in one bucket. Just like Laureen said yesterday, it's hard to say these studies are relevant, these studies are rigorous. There's a continuum on all of these dimensions, and if we start depending too much on labels, is this this kind of study or that kind of study, then I think we run into trouble. So it's not as black and white as that when you're an editor.
A couple comments. So first off, I think Bob and Shiva yesterday had it exactly right in saying, or in part to saying, that we need kind of to some extent both. And in my mind, it is not an either or an or. I would say in every single paper, we probably make trade-offs along different margins. Right? Sometimes a paper is has sort of a better way of identifying an effect. At other times, a paper is interesting and fascinating because of its data, or it's because of the question that it poses and doesn't necessarily fully answer it, but he puts the question on the table and it hadn't been previously been discussed. And so in my mind, this sort of, and Kurt's remarks in the morning panel also made this clear, that I think there is often a trade-off between external and internal validity, and we're making that trade-off for every paper. I think each of us would want to write a paper that's as externally relevant as possible and as internally valid as possible as well. But, I think there are these trade-offs, and I think editors recognize that in the papers. I mean, JAR has published papers that are entirely descriptive, not necessarily case studies, but take, Eugene's paper, for instance, that's published, Eugene Soltis' paper in JAR, where he got a firm to basically keep a log or a diary of their meetings with analysts. And then he was able to sort of show us, when do analysts actually meet with that firm? I mean, that's evidence from one firm. But I think it was fascinating evidence. It's something that we usually don't get to see. Or take, this year's JAR conference, there were 3 papers that would fall in that sort of more descriptive bucket. I mean, Jordan Schoenfeld's paper, for instance, was a really interesting paper because he showed us that there are these action-based contracts that people write that we had been unaware, and that you could actually get those off the SEC's, of EDGAR. And so to me, there are these papers that sometimes you just find them super interesting because of the data they bring to the table, or the phenomena that they describe. And then again, reflecting back on the discussion yesterday, and this is actually something we discussed on the terrace, is I think one place that we haven't talked about where you do see that we have impact on practice, and this isn't the journal, but it's a form of publication, so in that sense I wanted to bring it here, and that's the textbooks, right? So I teach an advanced valuation class, and have looked, I mean, it's financial analysis and valuation. And so I've looked at several of the textbooks that are out there, and they draw heavily on what's in the literature in terms of what do we know how markets price information. Very specifically, to what extent certain things in the notes get recognized in markets or not. You know, what the incentives are for earnings management, to what extent how markets respond to that, or the sort of standard FSA valuation type of questions. There's lots of work. And if you look at these textbooks, they reference this. The same is true for Harvard Business School cases. I mean, you know, my guess is many of you have used them. Think about the teaching notes, right? The teaching notes very often refer to some of our research. And so, I think we need to think about this impact, because I think they're also right in saying, you know, the impact of the field is important. But I do see, when we look, I do see places where we have that.
So I agree with what Mary and Christian have stated. In terms of methodology, I think it really depends on the context. It depends on the research question. The JAE and of course the other top journals have published papers that are based on just one company, and the JAE has had papers like that. Extremely insightful. You can call it one observation, but it's really the insight that is it's difficult to generate in other forms. You can really drill down on the specific circumstances of a particular company, and that becomes really useful. And we have obviously also published surveys, and some of them done by Shiva Rajgopal, very well cited. So the methodologies, these are just the tools, and the goal is really to generate unique insights that add to our knowledge. In terms of descriptive studies, and I think these descriptive studies are perfectly fine. They're oftentimes a logical precursor to the development of general theory. So we actually need them to help us understand how the world works. And we, at the journal and also the other top journals have published papers that you can say, that this might be descriptive, but it really gives you a lot of insights and it makes you think. So again, in some cases, maybe causality becomes sort of a more urgent issue, but in some other cases, that is not the case. It really depends on the specific research question.
The last question that I had on my list is there anything you would like to recommend to the young faculty here as they act as reviewers for your journals? Whoever would like to.
Okay, I'll do 2 sentences. One thing that I actually see quite frequently, and this goes, I think, to the discussions we've had, is that a paper sort of does something new, but the contribution is perhaps a bit more on the methodological side, or sort of reconsidering an issue that we've studied before and sort of does it in a new setting or with a tighter design. And reviewers often respond to that and say, we already know that. And so one of the most frequent things where I overrule reviewers is in situations where I feel like, do we really know this? And so I'm, there may be situations where we actually have a confluence of evidence, and rejections for contribution are, quite common. So I'm not saying that we should now no longer think about contribution. But I do think that we also, at times, need to sort of step back and say that maybe some of the work that we've published 20 years ago, and we've talked at the JAW conference about replication, that we might not have sort of revisited or re-examined them. That's sort of the term that Rob said we should be using. Is and so when somebody comes along and kind of in a way does that, and we're therefore solidifying the evidence In my mind, that can be a very important contribution, especially in light of the use of our work, say, by regulators, because we would then be moving the frontier by making sure that something that we think is there is in fact actually there.
And
Rather open up for Q&A, but I guess the only
Yeah.
comment that I would have is, it's easy to find fault with papers. You can find fault with every paper, and we need to do that. So don't stop doing that, but also try to figure out how to make the paper into a publishable paper. How to say, okay, how could they overcome this? Because there's a kernel of a really good idea here. It's a new idea. Maybe rough around the edges, but it's there, and that's what we want to know. We don't want a little dial turned on tried and true everything, one little dial, okay, fine, that makes a contribution, but let's shoot for the fences a little bit more. And it would be helpful if the reviewers kind of kept that in mind, saying, no, but journals are in the business of publishing papers, not rejecting them. So if you can help us figure out how to turn this into a publishable paper, that's as valuable as figuring out what the flaws are. We need to know the flaws so we can fix them. The authors can fix them before it goes to print, but try to keep an eye on how do we help this person get this idea out.
I just very quickly echo these sentiments. I think it would be nice for the reviewer to be more nurturing towards the paper. Of course, it does not mean that you would overlook the flaws, because those need to be, pointed out, and the editor can, work with you to assess the severity of those issues. But do keep in mind that there's, sort of a diamond in the rough, that we do want to discover that, and give the paper a chance.
So Peter said, like Bob, originally said I had a lot to say. It turns out I only have a little to say, and it's on this question. Because one of the things that we have done at Journal of Financial Reporting is change the solicitation letter when we ask for reviews. And there are two things I want to emphasize that we have started doing. The first is a very clear distinction between substance and commentary. The substance of a paper is how you gather data, how you analyze it, and what results, narrow findings. We got a p-value of this on this test. That's the substance. Everything else is commentary. So managerial relevance, all these things, a lot of the stuff we've talked about is not substance. And our goal, what we tell reviewers is we want to hold papers to absolutely the highest standards of substance. But if you have a reasonable disagreement about commentary, about who cares, or how did you expect this result or not, that's something to be hashed out in published discussions and things like that. It's not a basis for rejection. And the other thing that we emphasize is that we don't just acknowledge that papers make compromises, we embrace them. To get a new journal off the ground, it's enough for our papers to meet or exceed the standard of the top journals in some way, not in every way. And if that requires sacrificing some qualities to really lean into others, we're okay with that. And so, if you want to do something that's going to have really high managerial relevance, I think more than the other journals, that's going to matter to us, even, and it's going to help, even if it means that you're going to have trouble on other dimensions, and reviewers need to understand that as well. And with that, I will open it up to questions. Do we have the
I have a microphone already.
It doesn't matter who has their hand up. It's
That's
who
right.
has the mic in their hand.
That's right. So while that mic's being passed over, I appreciate the advice that that we should study and we should encourage young people to study what they find interesting and exciting. It should also be new and novel. I think was the phrase, new and novel, and so that I think that's fair as well. But my sense is, while we all might look at past year's quadrant and say the ideal is that we'd be up in the upper right-hand quadrant, I'm a little less concerned about trying to direct them to look to research for a few reasons. One is that my sense is that when we think about the subjective bar for incremental contribution on what's new, what's novel, what's enough, that reviewers and probably editors are more willing to publish to say like you're above bar if you're in the left column than that you're in the lower bar, right? That if it's just so the column is the bore column, right? So it's just like, do we know this yet? Is there a gap in the literature as opposed to a problem in practice that's trying to be addressed? And you know, I think that because PhD students often come in and say, like, with 1 or 2 or no years of experience and look for gaps in what they're told to study, that they want to do research around something that hasn't yet been looked at. That's new and novel enough. And that's why they are skeptical once a paper's been written on something. They think, well, that's that, and they move on. So they don't have the same threshold for both sides of that. And I think we all agree that upper right is best, but there's value in basic science and in answering real questions that practice struggles with. So why not just encourage them to also look to practice for interesting questions, not just for gaps in the literature? I don't see why we can't encourage that, or why we should be fearful of directing them that that's a valuable thing.
I mean, we did. Well, Hal just had to leave, but as I said in my remarks, a debate in practice is a research opportunity potentially. Potentially, maybe not. But sometimes they argue about things that it's like, we already know the answer to that. This is not interesting from our perspective. But
this was less pointed at you, Mary, and more pointed at Christian.
Oh.
Just to be clear.
Well, so I think maybe let me clarify and then give you an example. So I don't have a problem with the way you phrased it, and I think to say that when people look for what would advance our understanding, if that involved looking to practice and saying, here's a really interesting practice that we need to explain or need to better understand. But that's sort of how I would, for instance, view Jordan's paper. He's saying people are writing these action-based contracts and we had no idea, right? And so to me, that's okay. So if it came across as you should only be looking in the literature, that's not what I meant. And so I'm thankful that you raised that question. The example I wanted to give you is, I don't know whether you are familiar with Eric Zwick's paper on the capitalists in the 21st century. They got access to some IFRS data, so it's actually a tax paper. And when I first saw that tax paper, and it has obviously a lot to do that they were able to do this because they got access to the IRS data. When I first saw this, I was like, man, this is something that the tax accountants, that we should have done, we as accountants. And they did, but basically what they show is something that I think many of the tax accountants knew and know, is the importance of pass-through and what impact that has on who actually pays what in taxes. But they also just very descriptively describe who are the top 1% and who are the 0.1%. And one of the things that comes out of the paper is that it's a lot of this, it's the working rich. It's actually not people that have been wealthy for a long, long time. It's just been handed down, but that it's car dealerships that are in the 0.1% and certain other businesses. That paper was solicited to the QJE, right? Highest impact econ journal. Now again, fantastic data and all that, but I'm just saying, I think this was super relevant to the debate, but it's just providing some facts that we previously didn't have. And so to the extent we can find these gems, I'm all for it.
Yeah, so by the way, I think it's a great panel. I've always enjoyed this on. Yeah, the opportunity to talk to editors, and having 4 at the same time is very nice. And I have 2 questions related to a problem that is often observed in a regulator, and it has to do in the rulemaking process. When you write a rule and you do an economic analysis, you do 2 things. You do a literature survey, and the typical rule cites about 40 academic papers on average. And you also do original research, replicating studies, and doing an original analysis in that report. 2 things happen that are problematic. One is the replication of studies, particularly the lag of time or trying to repeat somebody else's study. I've had many economists come to me in supervising rules that saying, I can't get that result. What do I do? So question number one, is the current state of the journal process replicating studies, is it on the right track? Are there any issues? Are there improvements to be made in allowing access to data and reviewing the findings of studies? And the second question that I have has to do with a regulator often wants to confirm the status quo. The way you confirm the status quo often entails finding no result. And so often will be the case you can't find a paper that's been published on an issue because people probably researched it but didn't find anything and it got thrown in the garbage. So what do editors do, or how do they think about the problem of papers that contribute by the fact that they don't find anything, or can they?
Okay, I'm going to do this one.
Just in full disclosure, for those of you who were not at the JAR conference, we spent an hour and a half at the JAR conference, or an hour at the JAR conference, talking about replicating things. That's why we're all looking at Christian, because it was his panel at the, so.
And there is a video of the JAR conference and of the panel. I don't know how well, the discussion was very lively, so I don't know how well the discussion is going to come across in the video, but the three panelists that we had all had really interesting remarks, so I encourage you to check that out. So I think, Scott, you're raising two excellent points, and I think the replication one is one that several fields are at the moment struggling with, and I think we should also struggle with. You keep me honest, if I were to summarize the discussion we had at JAR, my sense was that a lot of people were worried about that. I think there was a sense that some replication happens, and it happens in various forms, and they're not necessarily out in the open. And then there was a sense that if now we all go, replicating our papers, who's going to be doing the new and novel research? And so that was sort of a concern that I've heard clearly in the discussion. My sense is that I think we should be able to do both, but probably, and we need, again, some division of labor here. So one thing that I've been wondering is to what extent we could have more research centers helping with some of the replication of the findings, because what became clear in that discussion, incentives of the people in producing replication aren't the same as producing new work. So that would be one thing. And then the other suggestion, I think we need to, and that's more for the no results that you talked about. I think there are examples of no results getting published, but that is often trickier. But I wonder whether we need also other forms of publication, like, for instance, a post-publication review, where people could just submit or maybe like Robert and I were talking about, maybe we need something called accounting letters. And it's like a 3-pager where you say, I did this result, it shook out, or I did this result, and there's no relationship there, and it's to be expected because of the following economics, and leave it at that. And we get that in the literature. That way we have sort of a deeper record.
So just one quick comment on the replication. Some of it is sloppiness on our part in writing. So when you write your paper, you should be thinking about, can somebody read my paper and redo what I did? I've tried to replicate papers that have been published, and it's like you read a sentence and it sounds clear until you go to the data. You say, well, wait a second. They Winsorized at the 1%, 99%, year by year, full sample,
Before or after.
Before or after, the details just aren't there, and so it's not a problem with the paper. The result, the inference doesn't hold. It's just that literally the way the paper is not written precisely enough to tell us. And the extreme is the code, which is what JAR has gone to. But in the middle is just making sure your paper is absolutely clear, how you constructed the sample, how the variables are defined, so that somebody could come back later and actually do it without saying, what on earth what are they doing?
Yeah, I just want to add to that. So at the JAR conference, and also at the dinner after the JAR conference, and the subsequent breaks, and all the opportunities where people could talk about this, there is the debate about whether we want to sort of a market-based solution in terms of replications of papers that people feel that there are papers that are important enough that are worth replicating, and chances are those have been replicated, versus sort of a more regulatory or sort of organized response, which is to have some kind of an organization, and then the profession would contribute resources, and then we would probably pick some papers by some criteria to replicate those. So my sense is, again, I'm just speaking for myself, I think the market is probably doing a lot of the work already. I mean, I get the sense that my papers are being replicated because I do hear from people asking me, about data, about things like that. And as an author, I always help them, with whatever questions that they have. Has it been done to the point where sort of every paper that needs replication, every paper that needs replication that the regulators are interested in have been replicated, and that has been documented? Probably not. But there might be some solution that is in between that would sort of make the best use of the limited resources in the profession to make progress on this issue.
I'm going to reply briefly, and then we have time for one more question. Peter has instructed me it is to come from a young faculty member. So but first I just want to say on Joanna's point, there's a lot of stuff we don't document. And like Steve Saltario has a paper where he argues that, yeah, there are a lot of replications in the literature, but everyone thinks they can't get published if they pitch it that way. So instead, it's a novel extension, and it has a replication hidden in it, and no one really knows. I would say the same is true, by the way, for field work, that people do fascinating studies where, the first 2 months, what they're doing is talking with a bunch of senior, money managers or whatever, and that inspires them, but they don't write it down. So I think documenting this stuff is the replications and the field work is really useful. Second, I guess I'm all for a division of labor, and here I'm speaking with my official, promoter of JFR hat on, because I think we're a great place for that. It's right in our mission. We're designed for it. We have a call for pre-registered re-examinations, and I'd encourage you to take a look at that, because it's not just a matter of, well, that's something we stand ready to publish. It's also something that I think is really good for doctoral students to do, and I encourage those of you who are teaching doctoral seminars to consider asking your students to write a proposal to re-examine a paper, and it can be, that way, right, it gets accepted before they know whether they're insulting senior faculty or not, because no one sees the results. So, whoever has the mic gotten back there?
Okay, this could be a naive question, so let me know if my premise is wrong or why this is a bad idea. But it seems just from casual observation that one place where we differ from the econ and finance journals is that those journals seem to do more desk rejections, and that seems to help speed up their publication cycle times. It saves reviewer time. If an article doesn't conform to the journal's mission, why as editors don't you take a more active role in desk rejecting papers?
TAR desk rejects papers, but I hear this all the time. We want faster turnaround. You also don't want your paper rejected. So you send it in, we can desk reject it. That's if that makes you feel better. So I think that's I'm being facetious, obviously, but I think people want due consideration of their papers. So we don't desk reject papers unless it's completely obvious that this person should never have sent this paper. It's a first draft, it's 10 pages long, it's got one table of descriptive statistics and a long conclusion, and, it's like, wait a second, no. Finish the paper and then send it back to us. But we err on the side of giving authors a fair hearing for their work. And so Could we just reject more? Maybe. And sometimes when I get, as a senior editor, I get editors' letters that say, you know, if I had spent more time with this and really thought about it ahead of time, I probably could have been desk rejected. But they don't want to prejudge, and so they like to get somebody else's opinion as to whether there's a nugget of something in there, and you can't figure that out on one quick look at the paper. So it's erring on the side of trying to help authors. And you know, sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. For the ones that don't get desk rejected and ultimately get published, we help them. The ones that don't get desk rejected but then get rejected after review reports, okay, they took them a few months, but we thought at least it was worth looking at. So, just a judgment call.
I mean, we're probably desk reject between 20 and 30%. It kind of varies, and depends also a little bit through time and through editors. It's different. We're probably closer to 20 than to 30, but we've had some periods where we're up to 30. But I think the trade-off is exactly like Mary said, and so my concern often is when it's a desk rejection, it's entirely on me. And so if I, have overlooked something, then, the paper got unfairly rejected and people's careers are on the line. I mean, you're right, it's a fast decision, but the turnaround at these journals is actually pretty fast. I mean, you usually hear within 60 days, I think, is usually our turnaround time. And so in that sense, I feel like it is giving you the benefit of the doubt when you get a reviewer. One thing we've now done, which is in the direction of what you're saying, is we've put these AEs, the associate editors, in place. And so that means that for the desk rejections that come via the associate editors, that at least 4 eyeballs have been on the paper. And we did this in part because we hear you, and it would speed things up, but at the same time, we also don't want to do this lightly. And so by having sort of 2 people look at this and come to a conclusion that this might be a desk rejection is helpful, and that's why we put that in place.
That's all we have time for. Thank you so much.